Here we go. Good morning. Good morning, Sergeant Major. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in this morning. And apparently we lost Facebook again. I don't know what's going on at Rumble right now, but Rumble and Facebook have not played well together for the past few months, at least. So we were back. We were back on Facebook for a while, but it looks like we lost them again. Anyway, let's talk about immigration again. I've been seeing a lot of noise. We've been hearing a lot of noise from the left, and Mario and I are going to talk about about one of these topics in great detail in a couple of days here. It's a surprise on Thursday, but I've been hearing a lot about immigration, about deportations, ICE raids, et cetera, et cetera. And when you see when you see the lefties talk about it, when you see the lefties talk about immigration, what you hear is arguments for slavery. Basically, they talk about why we should have these hostile foreign invaders in our country. All the arguments they're pro-slavery arguments, right? You got our birth rate's down. We need workers. Americans don't want to do the jobs. These people do the jobs that Americans don't want to do for low pay. Yeah, for low pay. Low pay. That's an important key there, right? Let me explain you something about inflation. Inflation only happens at one place. That's at the printing press. But there are market forces that drive the press as well. Now, if you shut off the printing press, inflation literally stops. Right? We're told often that that inflation is a function of the devaluation of currency. But that's a hard one for a lot of people to understand, because your average American, in fact, your average human being, does not understand what currency is, or what money is, or what wealth is, right? There are several concepts: money, currency, wealth, property, right? And there are a few others that go into this bucket as well, that get used in conversation colloquially as if they're fully interchangeable, and they absolutely are not. Right? There's some overlap in wealth and property, right? For example, your individual net worth is tied up in how much liquid cash you have, how much property you own, what other assets you own. But property and money and wealth and currency are not the same things. Wealth is actually a pretty esoteric concept related to your total asset holding against your total liabilities, right? Net worth and wealth are almost interchangeable. The difference there: wealth is essentially just your assets. Your net worth is your assets minus liabilities. And then there's currency. You see, the total wealth, the total extant wealth, is an esoteric number which we attempt to understand for the purposes of being able to deal with one another through the representative mechanism that is currency. The reason that inflation happens at the printing press is because every time you print a dollar, you change the fractional division of wealth by its trade value, right? So that, I know that's some wild and complicated shit to understand. But imagine there's $1 million worth of wealth that exists, and you say, well, that's not enough to go around for all 350 million Americans. We need more money than that. So we're going to go print a bunch of currency. Okay, now you've got a trillion dollars worth of currency, but you haven't changed the amount of total wealth, which means that your individual dollar is worth less. Now, we've talked a lot about how inflation, especially through the Biden administration, was just outrageous. Gasoline almost quadrupled in many places in cost. Eggs went through the roof, except the price of gasoline, the price of eggs, did not change in the same way that the value did, because the amount that you could purchase with your dollar went down. It's not that the price of the item went up, it's that the value of your currency went down. Right? If you own a house that's worth $500,000 today that sold for $100,000 20 years ago, your house is not worth dramatically more than it was 20 years ago, because it's not as if you can sell your $500,000 house and go buy, 5 identical houses for the same price, because your money just isn't worth that much anymore. Now, what does this have to do with immigration, fat boy? Many of the prices that we see at the grocery store right now are they're simultaneously artificially deflated and inflated. And that sounds counterintuitive, and it is counterintuitive. But let me help you get your head around it. Minimum wage is one of the various economic pressures that causes the printing press to go burr. The price of labor is artificially inflated by the existence of a minimum wage. In seeking to compete within the context of a lawfully enforced minimum wage, which, by the way, there is no place in the Constitution where the government is ceded the enumerated authority to issue a minimum wage. Come at me with your Commerce Clause, with your Welfare Clause bullshit. The federal government does not have the authority to tell you what you pay a person for services. That is a voluntary contract between individuals. But one of the primary arguments that's made for illegal immigrants is that, well, even if Americans would do the job, they won't do it for that little money. There's a glaring problem with that argument. Yes, an American who expects a higher quality of life is going to hold out for a certain level of wages to do certain types of work. And yes, there are people from foreign countries, shithole countries, which is most of the world, who are willing to accept a much lower quality of life, which can be afforded them for a much lower wage than the quality of life that an American expects to have. This has a few serious issues. And one of them that goes undiscussed is directly related to the individual misunderstanding of the delineations between wealth, property, currency, right, and money. If you are paying a large segment of the population intentionally depressed wages, and I'm not talking about paying people below the minimum wage, I'm talking about paying a ghettoized segment of people who are living in the lowest possible conditions, depressed wages. Guess what that does to the economy? It means that there are fewer consumers and therefore lower demand for luxury products, for high quality products, right? If you're increasing your ghettoized population, then you're going to see your 13 cents a metric ton ramen noodles stay dirt cheap, and you're going to see your steak prices inflate substantially. In large part, This is a function of repressed demand, artificially repressed demand. You have downpriced an entire segment of your population out of competitive purchase against an otherwise adequate supply, where now you have a supply that is struggling to find its demand as your economic purchasing power across the lowest end of your economy is depressed. If you are paying a little more at the lowest ends, right? This gets into some Laffer curve shit, right? Where it seems counterintuitive, but the more you lower taxes, the more tax revenue increases. Now, there's a point, obviously, if you take zero taxes, then your tax revenue is zero. And if you take 100% taxes, then your tax revenue is also zero, right? Hey, hi, Lincoln. Thanks for watching this morning, little buddy. Good morning. So if you, 0% taxes, zero tax revenue. 100% taxes, zero tax revenue. Because once you get to 100% taxes, there's nothing left for the economy to generate tax revenue off of. But somewhere between those 2 points on the Laffer curve, the lower the taxes, the higher the revenue, because the more money stays in the economy to create positive activity, which means that there's more wealth against which those taxes are levied. And do not mistake this argument for low taxes as a tacit endorsement of taxation. If I had my way, we would have zero tax revenue, and all federal revenues would be from rents and tariffs. But that's quite besides the point. The point being, the more you deport illegal aliens, if we were able to deport every single illegal immigrant right now, all 20 million of them, that is 20 million jobs that are suddenly available. Those jobs belong to companies that want to stay in business, which means those jobs will pay the lowest wage that they can afford to pay. Not the lowest wage they can get away with, the lowest wage that they can afford to pay. And in many of those jobs, take picking fruit in the field, for example. If there's no illegal immigration available to do those jobs, then what you have to pay to get an American to do that job is what you have to pay. Right? Our buddy Cameron is watching. I remember years and years ago, Cameron, I'm going to tell one of your stories. I'm going to tell it clipped, and I'm not going to do it great justice, but I need to get the point across. Years and years ago, Cameron was living with a girlfriend and one of her friends, right? One of her girlfriends. Not this wasn't some weird throuple shit. They were like roommates in college or something. So Cameron had a job, the girlfriend had a job, and the roommate had a bachelor's degree in something. You know what she didn't have was a job. And I was active duty Army when we were having this conversation. Cameron had a pretty good job at the time. The girlfriend at the time was waiting tables, I think. And the roommate, who did not have a job, said, well, nobody's hiring. And Cameron said, what do you mean nobody's hiring? Ruby Tuesdays is hiring, TGI Fridays is hiring, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these places hiring, waitresses, hostesses, et cetera. There's jobs. Well, I have a bachelor's degree. I can't I have a bachelor's degree. I can't do one of those. Bitch, until you have a job, no job is beneath you. If you're broke and unemployed, no. If you're broke and unemployed, every job is good enough for you. Especially in the world of, 37 flavors of feminism, where I don't need no man. I need a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Bitch, you can wait tables. Now, if you're looking for that job that pays you what you think you're worth based on the fact that you have a degree, I'll tell you something. Being unemployed when you apply to those jobs is not a mark in your favor. Bitch, go get a job. Go get you a job. Right? Like I told the story the other day, Cameron and I were at the same school shooting together. We were at an active shooter event before they were cool. And you know what I did that day? After the event was over, I went to work. I had a job. I went slap pizza doughs at Papa John's. Bitch, you are not too good for a job unless you've got a better job. The only thing that makes you too good for a job is having a better job. Okay? If you don't have, and there's a whole philosophical thing where we can argue about that with trust fund babies and the like, but what we're really talking about right now is whether or not you can foot your own bills. So what happens when the wages are increased on the farm workers, because now you have to employ Americans because there aren't any more hostile foreign immigrants to employ? Oh, well, you had to increase wages, so all the prices are going to go up. That is what happens when you have to increase the wages on something like fast food, because what you do there is you take the people who are making the lowest wages and in a tiny segment of the population artificially increase their wages. So now what happens, like the Fight for 15 guys, right? When Fight for 15 was going on, $15 an hour was a pretty common wage for the lower level skilled trades, like your electricians, apprentices, guys like that, right? And at $15 an hour 20 years ago, you were doing okay, right? That's about $30,000 a year. If you're doing construction work at $15 an hour 20 years ago, you're probably picking up 10 or 15 hours of overtime most years. So you might cap out around 45, 50 grand. And in 2005, $50,000 a year was pretty reasonably livable. Your average mortgage payment at that time was somewhere around $600 or $700 a month, right? It wasn't today where your average rent nationally is almost $2,500 a month. It's a very different economy, right? But what happens when the wages are not artificially inflated by something like minimum wage? So with the artificial inflation, what happens is you're raising up the lowest to be on par with everybody else without doing anything to change the circumstances of everybody else. So Mario talked the other day about having worked as a diver, as an underwater welder. And, after one of those minimum wage hike things, it turned out that, I could be underwater in the dark with a dangerous tool, risking my life, and it pays about the same as fucking, working the drive-thru at Chick-fil-A. Well, maybe I don't want to do this job anymore. And that is another problem that we're running into, is labor shortages in skilled trades because of the rapid approach of the lowest common denominator to the actual skilled laborer. But when the economic pressure comes from a need for supply side economics to make up the shortage in labor demand. I've got that backwards. For demand side economics to make up the shortage in labor supply, then the labor is valued against some worth calculation. I have to get my strawberries picked. Nobody will pick my strawberries for less than $20 an hour, which means I have to pay $20 an hour to get my strawberries picked. Okay, so all the wages just went up, except all the wages just went up in conjunction with supply and demand economics. And the result, rather than all the prices rising, which they will temporarily, but now, since you've eliminated the lowest caste of ghettoized, valueless individuals, what you're doing is you're paying people who are doing what many people think of as those dirty jobs, a wage which is commensurate with the economic pressure that generates that value, instead of with the lowest wage that you can get away with paying illegally to people who are actively evading taxes, taking against the system. And so now, all of a sudden, it's like, it costs us $20 an hour per head to get the strawberries picked. Yeah, but guess what? Now you've got people who can afford to buy your strawberries. Oh, that's right. That means you've got a larger customer base. Or what I was saying about the Laffer curve, 0% means zero tax revenue, 100% means zero tax revenue. Somewhere in the middle, the math works out. And the lower the taxes until you approach that 0 point, there's somewhere in here before you get diminishing returns that you have the lowest possible tax rate that generates the highest possible revenue. The same thing applies when you have essentially free economics. Because there is a point in there where the lowest wages are high enough to increase the customer base. Because there are only two ways to profit. Profit is earned in only one of two ways. Well, let me correct that. It is earned in two ways. One, the other, or both together. You can either have high distribution, right? That's volume, or high markup. That's value, right? You want to make money on diamonds? Well, not a lot of people buying diamonds, comparatively speaking, so the price is high. Now, you want to make money on nickel cheeseburgers? You can make a fortune on nickel cheeseburgers if millions of people are eating them. If you've got billions and billions served. Now, you're going to mark those nickel cheeseburgers up to $2.50? Well, that's a function of a nickel just not being worth a full 5 cents anymore. Right? Yeah, go take a look at the difference between a 1950s dollar and a 2025 dollar, and you'll just cry. You should just cry. Right? I bet most of you have seen the movie Back to the Future 3, right? When Doc was shot over a matter of $80. I figure you owe me $5 for the horse and $75 for the whiskey. Or no, it was the other way around. You owe me $75 for the horse and $5 for the whiskey. Y'all, I guarantee you that if you come to me with a bottle of whiskey that cost $2025, I will not be drinking whiskey with you. Right? And $75 for the horse. You're talking about. I think that took place I think that was set in like 1880 or something. I forget what year that movie was set in, but it was a little bit pre-1900, right? God, here's a good example. How much was the original Model T when it came out. Ford Motor Company, Model T came out in October of 1908 and cost $780 when it first came out, right? Which is the equivalent to $26,322 in today's money, right? You know, think of that. Think of that. Model T was $780, $800 in 1910, equivalent to a modern $26,300. That is not a function of supply-demand economics. That is a function of inflation, the inflation that has reduced the value of your currency. So you get back over to the supply-side economics, and you're paying your workers more as a function of the economy, not as a function of force. Uncle Steve says it went down from there. At one point, it was like 480. I was just reading it in 1925. It got as low as $280. Can you imagine? Can you imagine today being able to buy a new car for $8,000? Can you imagine being able to buy a new car for $8,000? And Dad, yeah, Sergeant Major, thank you. That's the next place I was going with that. And Ford paid a high wage so his workers could buy a car. He created the market. It was brilliant, right? Ford was a genius in many ways, and this was one of them. It didn't just mean that he could hire work. This meant that he could hire workers who lived further away, which expanded his pool of competitive market for labor in a significant and valuable way, because people could live further away and commute in. And it meant that every employee was essentially an advertisement for a product that literally everyone would eventually want. I mean, Ford absolutely blew it out. So imagine you run a farm, right? A cattle ranch. Let's say you're running a cattle ranch right now. You got a bunch of illegal aliens working on it. They all get rounded up by ICE. And now you're going to have to pay $50 an hour to get legitimate American cowboys to come work your ranch. But hey, guess what? The Mexicans you had before weren't buying your steaks because they couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford to buy steaks and then pay rent and expatriate billions of American dollars. Right? So there's nothing but good to be had here. And I think we can all take a lot from that. So I hate to cut it off now, but I had a couple of articles that I wanted to cover, but I spent so much time talking about the economic side. It's already 8:00, and unfortunately I need to get on the road. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks for watching this morning, guys. Y'all be safe out there. We love you, and we will see you tomorrow.